The basic question for the afternoon panel is, are there thoughts about how Falmouth could proceed with all the various ideas and possibilities that have been brought out? And are there recommended next steps that over a period of some time could bring Falmouth into a real sustainable leadership role like its citizens have voted for? And it's the two questions I brought up in the morning. What would sustainability look like for Falmouth? And number two, how could the plan and the next steps thread this needle through the regulatory requirements that Falmouth is being told from the state and EPA it needs to beginning, to make significant progress and provide assurances. Eric, can you explain where you are, and you want to come up? This is Eric Turkington, the chair of the Wastewater Water Quality Management Committee.
Well, a brief history of what Falmouth is and where our next step is. We had a committee that was appointed several years ago to look at preparing a comprehensive wastewater management plan for the whole town. That committee came back with a proposal that had a price tag of $600 million. And the town looked at that and said, we want another plan. So they appointed a follow-up committee called a review committee, and we spent the next 2 years coming up with a slimmed-down plan, to say the least, which included basically two parallel tracks. One was sewering in areas where there was no practical alternative, and testing out in a demonstration project, not just more studies, but really on the ground, in the water, demonstration projects of a half a dozen alternatives, and I think we've all figured out what they are. We took that to the Board of Selectmen. They unanimously supported it. We took it to the town meeting. They unanimously supported it. We took it to the voters and said, you are going to have to put money on the table to do these things. This is not just a theoretical exercise. They voted $2.2 million for the alternatives. And so now we have yet another committee whose job it is to make this happen, to identify projects, put them online, make them happen, study them, and see which ones are going to provide us an alternative to sewering in any place that we can possibly find an alternative to sewering. Is that a fair summary?
Wouldn't it be possible, given the commitments for the demonstration projects, to look back at the phase 1 and 2 plans for sewering and see if there couldn't be actually a better way?
Well, we would love to do that. And phase 1 and phase 2 is what she's referring to as an area that our consultant and DEP suggested, in fact insisted, needed to be sewered. They include about 8,000 households. It's a big part of the town. Obviously we're looking for anything that could make that a smaller area or not at all. But the premise here is that because we have these TMDLs, which we're all familiar with that now, right? That's where the University of Massachusetts in Dartmouth did a study of all our estuaries and came back and said, your estuaries have more nitrogen in them than will sustain life, or at least sustain any life you want in these estuaries. You have to bring it down by a substantial amount. And their recommendations in some cases were that in some of these estuaries, bringing it down meant sewering the areas immediately around it, the peninsulas with all these houses that contribute to it. So we've started out with their premise that sewering, in some cases, is the only answer. We would love to peel that back and have a better answer and a different answer. But right now, that is the answer that has been put on the table by the University of Massachusetts Dartmouth. And we have our consultant here who can correct me if I'm misrepresenting any of this, but I think that's where we are today. That, the alternatives have to produce a major result. You have 8,000 houses who for years have been putting all of their septage into the ground, and unfortunately, or fortunately, we have wonderful soil here when it all percolates right down into the estuaries. So we are really obliged to address what is coming out of those houses if we want those estuaries to have a livable level of nitrogen.
I think with that very important context, you've got, as I see it, and this is, God help me, what I do for a living, you've got two sort of critical path pieces. One is, and I just while sitting here received one of the more remarkable emails of my so-called career, which is the state of Vermont basically saying, okay, Waitsfield, you want to do your decentralized facilities plan with SRF? We're in, and we got steps for you. So this is, you know, yes, I'm ADD, no, I'm not on Facebook. This is very cool, and I think will be a great thing for New England if we can actually band together and pull this sucker off. The real question is this issue, and Hildy, you had it in your slide, of the only thing that counts for purposes of this TMDL is sewering. Or the driver for it is sewering. And you cannot blame or fault an engineering consultant for responding to that, because where the cheese is, the mice are going to follow. And unfortunately, as the mice find out, sometimes the trap snaps back on their necks. And what I think the fundamental question here is what regulatory latitude can be given. Where can pieces of cheese be put in terms of nitrogen reduction in a regulatory context to allow the town to see what you get out of a permeable reactive barrier, what you get from aquaculture? What do you get from looking at a piece of the sewer need and addressing that with a lower cost solution or a combination of them? I love the idea of a demonstration that is nationally defined. One of the most important things is do something somewhere so that we can poke at it and see how it works. So the question is, where will those regulatory pieces be put? In the context of a Cincinnati or a Cleveland or Philadelphia, in the combined sewer consent decrees, there's language that Department of Justice is okay with that says, all right, you need to, by such and such a date, have this plan for these alternative green infrastructure pieces and a monitoring program in place, and we'll see how you're doing to see if those reductions are equivalent to what we would expect from an engineered box. So there is a good precedent and framework for that.
And if I can just add to that, because I didn't hear it as clearly from you today as I have before. Like Paul Bishop said earlier, Cincinnati did have a mainstream gray underground storage tunnel plan.
Yes. Yeah.
And what the Department of Justice and EPA and the community have been working towards, that you've been a part of, is a demonstration phase in some of the neighborhoods for green infrastructure and a scaling back of the gray portion. And after some period of time, after monitoring results, some re-examination of the rest of that plan. And I think that that is a planning approach that might apply to Falmouth.
Yeah, that already exists. So let's put these in context. We have a 2-page letter from DEP that spells this out. That it exists. All of the flexibility that the town needs exists. And the short answer to it is what I was trying to say earlier was 2015. And if you look at things, and my understanding of the details of the town's approach is that by being going to go on design, the safe approach is to go on design. They don't need to build it, but within that window of time, in 2015 for discussion purposes, drop dead date, is that a substitute for that has to be on the books. Now, the DEP policy, and this is common, this is not just special DEP, this is water quality protection. TMDL it's a budget, is that the alternate that gets proposed, they just know what sewers do. Any alternate that gets proposed has to perform. Yeah. And there has to be a contingency plan that is to be triggered should the performance not be there. And the short, simple answer to that is that if you don't do it with the alternatives, you're going to sewer. But the bottom line is you're going to take the mass out. You have to, as a community, take the mass out of the water that causes the violation of the water quality standard within a reasonable period of time.
Can I jump in here? So the comment about only sewering can meet a TMDL, I'm not sure.
That's
quite.
debunked, that's debunked.
Yeah,
That is not true, and it's not required.
As the approver of the TMDLs, I agree that I don't think that's accurate, and I'm confused about where it comes from. There are the TMDL says here's the budget that needs to be met.
Right. You want to figure out how to meet that.
Right.
As a
and
community.
So there are places where we're farther along in implementing TMDLs where I think that's really clear from what we've approved as the way to implement them. Charles River being an example where it issues phosphorus, not nitrogen, but very analogous. And no part of that plan, or if there is a part, of a very small part, is conventional wastewater treatment. There's no sewering, there's a little bit of wastewater upgrades, but the plan is almost entirely 90% plus things like fertilizer reductions, like low impact development, rain gardens, that it's all land use, green infrastructure. Almost 100% of that plan to achieve the TMDL. So that, with the regulatory structure allows these kinds of approaches to happen.
Yeah, to that point, I'm glad you said that. It is my understanding, we're probably in a number of states, it is illegal for EPA and the state agency to dictate the solution. It's their responsibility to dictate that a solution be implemented. You got to correct the problem. EPA and the state is not empowered to tell you how.
I'd suggest adding a third element, because I think there's three important jobs here. One is to figure out what the best solution is, given all the factors we've all talked about all day long. Two is for the community to agree on the solution. And then three is to get the regulatory approval. And I think three is going to be by far the easiest of those three tasks.
Yeah, because number two, the agreeing to the solution, how is a community supposed to do a full and fair evaluation when what the SRF has set up to fund and what all the suggestion, the informal regulatory structure is set up to fund sewers? So it's really building a different planning model. You have to build a different planning model and fund it so the communities have the resources to evaluate that, which is what Falmouth has uniquely stepped forward to do.
Can we have a comment from Eric again? Because we're sort of on the side, Ken, that the third thing may sound easy, but things have, in conventional terms, have been going in such a fast track that it's a terrible crisis to back up and take another look.
A very intelligent presentation about how shellfish can really be a huge factor in cleaning up an estuary. And the head regulatory fellow from the state, who was here from the shellfish, from the DEP, whatever, said in this room, I will give you no credit for shellfish. Okay, there's one. Well, they might all die. Well, okay, so whatever. Whatever his reasoning was, we were getting no credit for shellfish. And there's a town down the other end of the Cape where opening of a channel, we all talked about opening of channels as a way to increase flushing. God opened a channel down there with the last hurricane. And so they went to the state regulators and said, well, now we have a channel here. This should change the sewering context since we won't have to sewer this area. They said, well, no, God might shut it. This is what we're up against.
So who has some advice for Falmouth? How about you, Paul? Did you have?
Well, firstly I can say thank you. It's been a fascinating day. It's been my first time up to the Cape, and it's just wonderful to see the community mobilising like you are.